you have this massive release of DMT when you die, and so you're just having a psychedelic trip. That's the similarity. But that doesn't hold water evidence-wise because of some of the things that have happened in near-death experiences, really.
So my goal with this podcast is, I mean, by the title, it's going to be about death in some way.
Okay.
The reason I want to talk about this, especially with you first, is because this subject is almost taboo. It's one of those things that you really have to tread lightly when you talk to people about this kind of stuff. And especially if somebody has lost somebody. And I think the mystery kind of surrounding your ultimate end, I think that's what freaks people out about it the most. And that's why it's like, I don't even want to think about it. If I can put it in the back of my mind and avoid it, then I can live in a more blissful state. And I've struggled with that myself as well. Do I think about death? Do I talk about it? Do I make that something that I reveal to people, or do I just leave it kind of just filtering through in my brain? And that's kind of been this back and forth. So I decided I want to do podcasts with people about this. I want to sit down and say, what do you really think about this? What are you afraid of? And why is it that we don't talk about this with people? When I texted you first, the subject of death, what was your initial thought on that?
Oh my gosh, where do I begin?
Okay.
Because I've thought about it so much for so many years. What's really weird about the day and age that we live in are all the therapies that are coming up in the next 10, 15 years that really might have you guys. It's not unlikely at all for you guys. It's even a possibility for someone my age to escape our mortality. They call it the death escape velocity. So that's a whole different existential problem,
right?
You know, that it presents. It's also hopeful on the other hand, but so that's the one thing that I thought about. It's very possible that we will be asking the question, not what is going to happen when we die. Instead, we'll replace that with, well, what happens if I don't die? What's that like?
Right. Like, why would you want to live longer than...
Right. People will have to, well, I guess we'll know, how much faith people really have in their belief systems, won't we?
True. If you can decide to say, I'm not going to gamble on this. I know that I am living here now, and I know what this kind of entails. So I'm not going to take a gamble on either it being something new, some other new sort of awareness. And I think awareness really is the key there. I think like when you see people with dementia and they are not the same that they were, they don't have the same ability to be with you in that moment. You can kind of see, okay, they've slipped away a little bit, and maybe their memories are not even real anymore. And that's what I think is really crazy, how your mind gives you stories and gives you memories. And I think we are afraid of losing that. We're afraid of either our loved ones forgetting about us, or can you imagine the tunnel or whatever happens, and it's like everything you knew, everything you were, everything just goes away and it's not important. And you did say before we started, there's a lot of similarities between near-death experiences and psychedelics. And a lot of times people say, if they've been on some sort of a trip, that they almost have knowledge suddenly that when they come back, they can't interpret. There's no way for me to be like, this is the thing that happened and this is what I knew. They just know that they did know.
Yes.
They know that suddenly they weren't afraid. They knew who they were. They knew where they were going. They knew everything. And it was this glimpse of terrifying hope. And then you come back and you're like, I can't even explain it. So I think those are two very, very interesting things as well. That this idea that we have this consciousness and we can also escape it and go into other areas of awareness. So what do you think about that whole thing?
Which things specifically, the psychedelics or the
similarities,
the commonalities?
Yeah, okay. Between the two of those.
Yeah, I think the reason that there are common experiences between psychedelic trips, at least in high dose scenarios. So this isn't personal experience, but this is reading the studies that they've done on psilocybin at Johns Hopkins for now, I think 25 years. So they have a lot of data that they've collected. And the similarities between those hero dose trips, where it's a high dose of psilocybin,
which are mushrooms,
and death, near-death experiences. The materialist would say, well, yeah, that's because there's, you have this massive release of DMT when you die, and so you're just having a psychedelic trip. That's the similarity. But that doesn't hold water evidence-wise because of some of the things that have happened in near-death experiences, really. I don't know if you want me to go into that, but...
Let's just talk about it.
Okay. So the similarities. There is what people talk about from psychedelic trips, an ego death, and then there is a similar effect when you die. Obviously, you have the ultimate ego death, right? Mm-hmm. And what's interesting about that is all of the world's religions, well, the major world religions will tell you in some form that the self that you experience here is not ultimately real. Mm-hmm. It's not that it's not real. See, they struggle for words to explain this, and so I am too, but nothing is permanent and everything is interconnected. So there is no enduring, for the Buddhists, they would say there's no enduring substantive you, because it is the you that you're experiencing is connected to so many other things. In fact, they would say you're connected to everything. Mm-hmm. And Jesus didn't go into that kind of detail with it. He didn't try to defend that view, but he definitely talked about you have to die to who you are in order to become unified with God, which we call salvation. Okay. So what happens what I think anyway, this is just my opinion, what I think happens in the psychedelic experience is similar to the death experience, because your consciousness is freed from the governor that it has as a brain. So the brain serves as a governor, like a governor on a car. It can only go this fast. But what happens is you remove that governor temporarily with psychedelics, and in death, it's just gone. So I think that's why there's a similar experience. And the reason I don't agree with the materialists isn't because I want religion to be right. It's because the evidence from near-death experiences says that, yeah, they come back and their clarity is so remarkable, they don't even know what to make of it. It's not something that is just... Jordan Peterson talked about this too, didn't he, Ryan? How did you put that? I'm
sure he has. I'm trying to remember. I mean, when he was talking about it, I heard him talk about it with Matt Dillahunty, the atheist, when he had the debate on that, and he talked about religious experience and how it's a proven method for curing things like smoking. Like most people, you can't cure smoking just with a drug, but with something like a psilocybin trip, yes, if it elicits a religious experience, then there's a greater chance for a stop in smoking, like a significantly higher chance. Absurdly high. It's like 86% right. of those who were smokers were able to quit for extended periods of time, at least 6 months, and they didn't follow them beyond that. Right. That's unheard of. So I don't know what you're saying specifically, but that's what I remember him saying as far as psilocybin trips go.
But
in
you're
that
saying
conversation with Matt Dillahunty.
That they kind of have to have a religious or a spiritual fact, like a... Yeah, they have to have some sort of religious experience in the psilocybin trip. It's not just that you take psilocybin, right, but that psilocybin is the most reliable way of, or psychedelics in general are mm-hmm. the most reliable way of eliciting a religious experience. So we have this thing that we can take and have this experience that has profound effects that nothing else that we know of has those right. effects. And he counts that as evidence, essentially. Yeah.
Yeah,
so I don't think that
wasn't
answers
the
your
evidence
questions.
that I was looking for, but I mean, it is interesting. They can 90% or 92% of those who had these mystical experiences, these life-altering experiences, it really did change their lives. It changed their whole worldview. But that's not the evidence I was looking for as to why it doesn't hold water to say that what the materialist says that. Yeah, the similarity is simply because you have this huge DMT release in the brain when you die.
Well, I know he talks about dreams and how there's theories from a materialist standpoint that dreams are all just a random collage of things and events that have happened throughout your day, and how that's not necessarily true, because of if that was true, it would be more like white noise than it would be these narrative scenarios that play out.
Where you wake up and you actually feel some sort of emotional trigger or something. Like, I can actually remember my dreams based on feelings and almost smells and sounds. It's really, really weird. And this whole thing with dreams and psychedelic trips and just consciousness all together, do you feel like the reason why this is such a strange topic for people to talk about is because there are an infinite amount of opinions about everything?
I don't think that's the main reason people don't want to think about it. I think, well...
Like, there's no way to know, so why talk about it?
I think the people that do talk about it, usually because of their experiences, they don't have sufficient language to describe their experiences. And so then people who haven't shared those experiences look at them like, yeah, you're freaking crazy.
Yeah.
So I'm not going to pay you any mind, Mm-hmm. But guys that are willing to think about it, whether they've had that experience or not, although I know Jordan Peterson has had the experience, but those guys who are willing to think about it and be open to what this actually is, they don't, they're rare, Most people just don't, they can't connect to the language that people are trying to use to articulate the experiences. I think that's one of the big reasons. And when it comes to death, they're just afraid.
Right.
It's easier to live, they think. It's easier to live by ignoring their existential or their fear of death.
Mm-hmm. Where do you think that stems from? Do you remember your first encounter, let's call it that, with death, which is, it could be the death of an animal, it could be you watching a movie and somebody dies in the movie. Like, I remember being very young and thinking that actors who portrayed death had to commit to dying. And I remember being like, why would they want to do that in this movie? Like, why this movie? Yeah. And that being such a weird thing to be like, oh wait, they're pretending. And it was kind of this journey into, okay, what is that? And then losing people and not actually comprehending what death is. Like, to this day, I get really weird responses from myself. Like, sometimes I'm just like, oh, this doesn't affect me whatsoever. And then I'm like, why not? This is really strange. And then there's somebody that I'd never even met, like a famous person who passes away, and that actually affects me. And I'm just like, this is backwards. What's going on? So do you remember your first interactions with dealing with death?
The one that I remember is when my grandfather died on my mother's side. I remember thinking a lot about that.
How old were you?
Maybe 10.
Okay.
10 to 12.
Okay. Was it just old age, or was there some sort of...
No, he had an aneurysm.
Oh, wow.
He was pretty severely alcoholic, and so he just had beat his body up really horribly. So he died young. He was like 60. Yeah.
So what do you remember what you did to process that?
I asked him, "What's it like?" And he didn't answer. But for whatever weird reason, I felt some peace by just asking him, taking that action. And so I guess you could say it's, as a kid, I was pretending that he was still there, but he's not in a position to answer me, but he's still there. He's not gone, his body's gone. So I started to process that stuff that way as a kid.
Were you religious growing up? Was there a story that was given to you about where people go when they die?
I wasn't religious in the institutional sense because I grew up in kind of a new age spiritual environment. My mom. So I was spiritual for sure. I was very spiritually curious, and I read books that she read, and we would talk about them, and all that. So definitely was something that we talked about, and death was not seen as something that was permanent. You're just gone. You no longer exist. So that's the story that was handed to me.
Okay. So you didn't live your whole life with this, like, almost this, after this is where life truly matters. So I'll use the example of being in middle school. Being in middle school, your teachers would almost tell you, like, this doesn't really matter because when you get to high school, that's what colleges look at. So it was almost this, like, preparing for the thing that then actually matters. And growing up where I think from my family, it wasn't necessarily the story, the same story that I was getting from going to church and being a part of youth groups and things like that. But I remember what you do here, like, you just have to be a good person and make sure that you basically get on God's side, because heaven is where it truly matters. And that's where you'll see everyone again. So it's almost like you don't want to be left out of the party. And I remember thinking, okay, but that doesn't make me feel less afraid of the suffering and the weird, confusing feelings that you get when you're experiencing that here. And I was never given a good enough story on how to deal with death while I'm here. That it's not just this pearly gates will be opening, angels will be singing. It's going to be this beautiful, gentle, amazing thing. And I feel like that's comforting for some people, and maybe for children, to have this non-terrifying idea. But that doesn't set you up for success as you start to grow up and you start to think and you start to say, okay, this doesn't really add up. So why is it, I mean, you're a pastor, so you deal with people and their issues and how they're feeling and how they're comprehending what's going on around them. What would you say, what could people do to start the journey to a healthy way of viewing death?
Think about it. Contemplate death. Visualize your death.
Even if it's terrifying?
Definitely if it's terrifying. And it should be, because you don't know. And that's okay. That's how we start. But once you start to contemplate your death, you'll find after a while the terror goes, it kind of dissipates. And you become more and more okay with not knowing, which is that quote that I told you from Tillich. That's what he's getting at. If I just paint the picture that there's something better on the horizon, that'll work for the anxiety of death for a while, especially when society is very distracted with simply surviving from day to day, like, let's say, in the Middle Ages. But it doesn't work once you get to where we are, especially when you consider that we're on the cusp of therapies that may grant us more immortality.
Right.
So then you find yourself in a new kind of anxiety. You're experiencing a new kind of anxiety, the anxiety of meaninglessness, the anxiety of doubt, about all those Sunday school stories that you heard, and the goal of getting to that pearly gate and that sort of thing. It just doesn't work anymore. Mm-hmm. So what I think Jesus would say, I think all the great sages would say is, look, just stare at it. Mm-hmm. Make yourself aware of it. And what they all testify to, all of those who take that, what you might call, mystical route, staring at the mystery is what I mean by mystical. Mm-hmm. What they all say is that they enter into a bliss that words fail to describe. A bliss about all of it. That all of it is good. That the things that they suffer, we inevitably suffer. When they are in the midst of their suffering, they have an inner sense of joy about it. That's what they all say. And it doesn't matter what religion you're talking about. any religion that you want to look at that has a mystical branch to it, they all say the same thing. And their advice is start looking at reality for what it is, not for what you hope that it is, not what you think it is. Just look at it for what it is. And when you don't know, admit that to yourself and deal with the fear of not knowing until eventually, and they don't know how to explain why this happens or even the process of transformation. They don't know that words fail. Mm-hmm. But they do all say you get to a place where you no longer fear. And not only that, you're blissful about all of life, including death.
Do you think religion is almost a way to try to find the words to describe all of this? Would you say that kind of knowing where we're going to end up, which I think makes us different from other animals, that we can kind of see the future and we know where we're headed. We're not just living in full bliss every day, like I'm here and this is all I'll ever be. Mm-hmm. We know kind of what's to come in a sense, but I think the not knowing the details, I think what throws everybody off. Do you think that religion creates this avenue for people to say, these are the things that I'm afraid of, and this is a way to try to find answers to it, or if I can't find answers, a way to live with this fear until it becomes something that I can understand and grapple with?
Yeah, so I think that religion comes on the scene as a coping mechanism first, but
like in its history, like religion in its
yes.
history was a coping mechanism for this.
Yes, dealing with the anxiety of death or non-existence. But I think what happens is those who follow that course of thinking as rationally as they can and really take their religion, they have taken their religion to the place where it actually does deal with all of that existential angst. It really does. And it's none of them would say, yeah, so I've fooled myself. They would say, no. I have stared at reality long enough. I know all of its terrors, and ultimately it's all good.
How can someone do that? How can someone be honest, especially with something that is so terrifying like that? Mm-hmm. How can someone be able to look at something with reason or some sort of tool? It's almost like you need a toolkit that says, don't think the way that you normally think, because you have to look at it at a way that you haven't looked at it before. So when it comes to examining your beliefs and examining why you hold those beliefs, how do you do that in a non-biased way for yourself? Like, how do you take inventory of your own thoughts and say, okay, what am I truly afraid of? Because you hear it all the time. People say things like, I don't care what people think. They say, I'm not afraid of this or whatever. And a lot of times that exact phrase is a clue that says, but you are.
Exactly. Yeah.
And so when you see somebody that says, I have maybe some kind of security in what I believe, I know exactly where I'm going, I know exactly what the point of my life is, I know. And if you take a couple steps back and you say, but you can't know. Mm-hmm. And that's what I think the beauty of this life is the ability to choose and you can kind of direct your own path to some extent, but there's always going to be that mystery element. Mm-hmm. And I mean, who knows what 500 years in the future is going to hold for us, but right now, currently, you cannot simply hold the belief that you know things that can't be knowable until they happen to you. So what is that person's step? How do you take inventory in an honest way?
I don't know that everybody can. And I can imagine a world, a reality where that some people are living this experience out just with the terror and the denial, and that all that experience matters for them. And that maybe in this lifetime, they don't get a handle on that. We know that they don't. We know the vast majority of human beings don't.
Right.
mystics are a minority for sure. They always have been. But I guess if, on the other side of it, if it is true that anyone can accomplish this, like Kabbalists would say, that those are Jewish mystics, they would say anybody can escape the fear and the repeat of life experiences and so on. Some call that reincarnation, whatever. Anybody can do that in one lifetime. But they do have to constantly examine how honest they're being with themselves.
Right.
About the reality that they're experiencing.
And what replaces the fear? That's my curiosity is, okay, currently I have this very strange draw towards that subject because it's something that I don't understand. But at the same time, I could easily be like, this is too crazy. This is too much. Let's not think about it. Let's live in that bliss. But I know that weird fear, and when I'm driving and it's just like, is this the last time I'm going to get in my car? Like, those thoughts plague me all the time. And I think it's just because I haven't given myself the chance to sit and talk and think about what I actually think. But when you say that eventually when you do that, down the line, you don't really know how, but you release that kind of fear. What goes into its place? What do you hold then when you're like, okay, now I don't have this fear anymore. It's going to be okay. Like I have to be okay with this. What then? What do you think then?
I don't know, because I haven't gotten there.
Okay.
But I can tell you what those who say they've gotten there say.
And those who say they've gotten there are the people who are usually in a religious arena, or have there been people that are like, what kind of a person are you when you no longer have the fear of death?
Truly no fear of death? Yeah, I think across the board they're going to be what most people would consider religious. Okay. That's so, what do we mean by that when we say religious? But if we were to define it as that conscious state that well, I guess, I don't know. Because the reason I'm struggling is because every definition ends up having a hole in it.
Right.
But yeah, for most people, the way they think of religious, they would say all of these men and women who reached a state of existential bliss, regardless of their circumstances, were religious people. Yeah. Okay.
So if we use that definition, have you ever met someone who has had a near-death experience or some kind of spiritual, or we'll say religious experience that deals with this whole thing? Have you ever had a conversation with somebody like that before?
Yeah. And I've read a lot of more interesting ones than the people that I actually talked to that had them. But yeah, as far as a person that I actually knew, when I started ministry in the Lutheran Church, the pastor that I served under, his wife had one. And she had a lot of the typical markers that you hear about in the near-death experience, the white light that eventually forms into a tunnel, traveling through the tunnel, seeing people that had passed before, welcoming her, and then she also she ended up in a garden type environment, beyond description in its beauty and the feelings of love, again beyond description. She couldn't, I don't know how to describe this to you, she'd say, and just feeling very much at home, like, oh, I remember all this now. Yeah, that's very common in near-death experiences, where they just feel like, oh, I'm back. Yeah, I'm home.
And that feeling is also heard in psychedelic trips, where it's like, I've been here before. It's almost a deja vu type feeling where you feel familiar.
Right.
That's really interesting. Now, I have a question about that. Do you think that a near-death experience is similar to something like a psychedelic trip, whereas you have that knowing that you will be going back? As in, you have a near-death experience, and it's only near-death because you do live again, and that when a true death happens, there is nothing. that's almost like a scale, that it's like you have the ability to live again if they bring you back or something. And that's why you have these dream-like, you have something happening. And when it is a lights out, like you can't come back, that it's a different experience?
No.
Okay.
Unless I'm not understanding the question.
It's almost like they can physically return, like they're not fully gone. They could have died.
The psychedelics, you mean?
I mean, you can experience that also in psychedelics. I'm talking about, like, let's say you fall off a bridge or something.
Oh.
And they're like, are they alive? They check your pulse. You're literally having a near-death experience right in that moment. But the reason you're having that near-death experience is because you have the capacity still to come back and live here again, consciously aware, like how you and I are right now. So the question would be, if it is a real death to where your body it's done, you can't come back to it.
And there's no question scientifically that that person is dead.
Right. They have died.
Mm-hmm.
Do you think that those are two different experiences? Do you think that person also saw the tunnel and also went to a garden and also did that whole thing?
Yes.
Okay.
Because, and there's actually evidence for this, which sounds dumb because the person came back. But I think there's a couple of cases like this. One was in a very experimental case where this woman had, I should have looked her up to remember her name so that others could look her up. Mm-hmm. But so in 1996, I think it was, she was diagnosed with an aneurysm in her brain, and it was inoperable. Her neurologist said, go and get your affairs in order. It could happen any second. It could be months from now, but you're going to die from this. Mm. And it's not going to be long, so get your affairs in order. So she started researching things. She found a facility out in Arizona that was busy doing a lot of experimental stuff with brain issues, mm-hmm. and operating on things that, on problems that others wouldn't touch.
Okay.
So she got a hold of them, and then she, after talking with them, she went back to her neurologist. They talked. He said, yeah, you're going to die otherwise, so yes, go ahead. Go see them. Mm-hmm. So she did. And what they did to save her life is they killed her. There is no question whatsoever that she was dead, because she was dead for hours and hours. I forget how long it was. Yeah. So it's not like what happens in an emergency room situation where a person has heart failure and then the brain is not showing any signals and so on. And so we can say that they were clinically dead, but we don't know for certain that there was nothing of consciousness whatsoever. Mm-hmm. With her, they can't say that. They know for a fact that she was dead as dead can be.
How did they kill her? Do you know?
They lowered her. Well, first they made her unconscious, and then they induced a coma, and then they just kept bringing her body temperature down to the point that there's just no way you can live. And then not only that, they did this to preserve her, the integrity of her cells, long enough to drain all of the blood out of her body. So she literally had no blood.
What?
Yeah.
You're going to link this in the comments or something so people can look this up. Yeah.
And then they went in and they dealt with the aneurysm.
Okay.
Now there's no blood. She's not going to bleed out. She's already dead.
Right.
So, and then they slowly, they brought the blood back into the body, and then this is hours. Mm-hmm. And then slowly warmed her up. And then she became conscious again.
And she was still herself with memories and everything?
Yes. And a very vivid near-death experience, or a death experience, yes.
So was it the same kind of tunnel? Mm-hmm. And
Yeah, a lot of the same markers. Her uncle, I think, her uncle was her guide. Okay. And at one point, after she seemed like she had been there, time just goes away.
Right.
And she's feeling home. She's all those things. She's just loving her new life, right? Her new old life. Mm-hmm. And she, all of a sudden, her uncle says, oh, you have to go back. She said, what? What do you mean go back? Go back where? you have to go back to your old life. No, I'm not going back, And she said the experience was like she was pushed, like he somehow pushed her, is the best thing she could think of to describe the sensation. And then pow, pain and cold and just feeling awful. She's back in her body,
Yeah.
And so this is a case where there's just no scientific explanation for.
So I have a question about that.
Yeah.
We did a podcast with Kevin, who Kevin O'Hara, and we talked a little bit, we tried a little in the quantum field of things. He talked about the double slit theory and how when those particles knew that they would be observed, they acted in a different way.
Yeah.
So here's my question.
Yeah.
Because she was ultimately brought back, and if you imagine we are living in time, like we're living on a timeline, and if when you die, you are outside of that. So we can maybe assume time is a part of this, whatever we're in. And if you popped out of that, if knowing that she was going to come back is in the cards, then did she have that near-death experience with her uncle and everything because they, whatever, knew she's ultimately going to come back? Like, it's going to be a pretty crazy thing. Like, she didn't fully die. And so that's where I'm like, really intrigued, because we will never be able to talk to somebody who has fully dead, gone, they're gone.
Never came back. Right. Yeah. I mean, so how do you answer that question?
Right. So
I can just tell you what I believe.
Right. Exactly. And that's why I think it's so interesting, because your mind wants to make sense of things that are going on. And so it's almost like a narrative, because our brains work in that world. We tell each other stories. We tell ourselves stories that say this makes sense because we don't like the unknown. We don't like the mystery. And in order to get over this ultimate mystery, which is what the hell happens to us, you kind of have to have this is what I would like. This is what a lot of the evidence shows. Like you've done enough searching to know that you can say, I think that woman had that experience. Whether the quantum particles knew she would come back or not, and they behaved in a certain way to where she still had that experience because they knew she wasn't quite there. She didn't quite die. But I mean, draining your entire body of blood, that's kind of crazy. So when I look at these kinds of things, I find it super fascinating. And I think some people may find it morbid and crazy to even think about, but what do you think could happen? And this is an experimental podcast, by the way. Like, we kind of went into this, like, you have quotes and things like that, but I went into it thinking, how does a conversation about death go with someone? How do you sit down with someone? And I know you, but how could strangers sit down and talk? And where do they begin? And at what point in the conversation, like right now, if you were somebody that I didn't know, I probably wouldn't have asked you, but what do you think about quantum mechanics and whether she died or not? Because that's one of those areas where it's like, are we really going to get into it this deep? But that's where my brain goes. And that's why I want to talk about this kind of stuff, because it's
I'm so glad.
Good. So, but what would you say to people who, and the death topic is what we're talking about, but there are there's endless topics where people say, nope, I'm done. I don't want to go there. I don't want to talk about this anymore. You can't know. It's pointless, whatever. It would just be details at that point. So how can we make the conversation about death something that people are willing to participate in and willing to say, these are some stories that I've heard before, and this is what I thought about it. Or even people who say, I've had psychedelic trips and they made me feel this way about it. Like you mentioned, Johns Hopkins University, they are literally taking people who are afraid and they're facing it's going to happen soon. Their death is coming. They're terminally ill. There's something happening there. And what I think is so interesting is these people put together a program. You go into a room, it's low lights, you have a blanket, you have a couch that you can lay on. There's nature photograph books, like you can just flip through and look at them. They're not like psychedelic art to where it's like, whoa, this looks crazy. It's like just nature is supposed to keep you calm. The best part is that there's people who put together an entire 6 to 8 hour soundtrack of all different kinds of music that basically take you on this journey. And the point of this therapy, and you take mushrooms, the point, and this very like dosed out, you have somebody there with you. Like, it is not just like going in your basement and doing it and being like, I think I had this experience. Like, they really tried to make it as medically sound as possible.
I think they actually do it intravenously.
Really?
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't think that
I know they've done that with DMT.
They have done that with DMT, but I think the psilocybin is taken orally.
You're taking it as with the plant matter?
You're taking synthesized. I mean, they
not,
extract the psilocybin.
Okay, it's okay. So you're not eating like actual mushrooms, though.
No.
Okay.
Sorry.
But what I love, that was interesting, because they have done studies where they literally put DMT into a IV, and they're like, take me back. Like, they literally have subjects that sit there, go crazy on a DMT trip, come back, write down what they saw. They give them more, they go back. So there's a lot of really, really interesting studies on that. But the point of this, and this is why I respect psychedelics so much, is there are people who are using it for specific purposes. And that specific purpose is when those people come out of this John Hopkins thing, the style that they do it, they have been able to grapple with what's about to happen, and they are truly at peace. Like you were talking about with smoking before, you have this one-time kind of experience, and it can actually transform who you are, how you see everything, and it stays with you. It isn't one of those things where it's like, yeah, it's wearing off and whatever.
Right.
It's one of those things where it is like a near-death experience where you're like, I can't explain it to you. I've experienced it, so therefore that's my knowledge on this.
It fundamentally changes their worldview.
Exactly.
They're no longer afraid of death.
Right. And so I see this, and I'm like, there are therapies now, and I mean, we could get into a whole new talk about why those specific types of drugs are completely illegal and like sought to be destroyed and eliminated. And it's like, if people are literally using this to grapple with death, which again, going back to the beginning, that's what we're all sitting here talking about and thinking about. If you can use something like that to come to terms with it and then say, I can now live the rest of my life in peace. Imagine not having to take psychedelics. Imagine not being faced with death. Imagine just being a person and being like, okay, I've done the work to now not be afraid of this.
Now I can be.
Exactly. That is my ultimate goal. And I think that's probably why I'm drawn to death and why I want to do these podcasts, is for that. I hope that these kinds of conversations can lead people on some sort of journey, however that looks, to maybe eventually say, okay, with enough conversation, we've come to this conclusion. Do this, and do this, and hopefully you'll be on your way. Have you ever heard of anything like that before?
Yeah.
Where there's like a system to...
Yeah.
You have? Mm-hmm. Okay, what is it?
This is, I think, why Buddhism is on the rise the way that it is in the West. Well, I think there are two reasons. For those who are really looking for a genuine way to deal with their fear of death, fear of the unknown, they are utilizing it more for why the Buddha decided, I'm going to go back and I'm going to teach whatever I can to help other sentient life escape this fearful existence. Mm-hmm. And then there are those who have adopted it because it increases their performance and leads to them attaching to things, which is literally the opposite of what the Buddha intended for it.
Right.
Yeah, it's always a thing.
But look, the main weapon in the arsenal, if you want to use that terminology, is just mindfulness, what Buddhists call mindfulness.
Yeah, what does that mean?
What Christians call contemplation. So It just means being aware, focusing on an aspect of your experience for what it is. What is the reality of how am I feeling? What is actually happening? Not trying to figure out what it all means, not admitting when I don't know, admitting when I'm not certain. How does that make me feel? It's just facing reality for what it is. Mm-hmm. That's what mindfulness is. It's not rocket science. It's just a scary thing to do.
Right. What are the trigger points within yourself to notice when you are thinking rationally about what's really going on, and when you are telling yourself, well, this is what I wish was happening, or this is what I want people to believe is happening, because we convince ourselves all the time. In fact, we are probably the ones who do that the most. How
to ourselves, you mean?
Yes.
Yeah. We lie to ourselves more than anyone. Yeah.
Exactly. So how can you be your own lie detector, or do you just need another person in order for that to work? Because Ryan and I have made it a thing to where we don't want the other person to be caught in a cycle of, what would you call it? Like
self-delusion?
Yes. Like a delusional state of existence, to where and can you imagine someone realizing that in you and not caring enough to say, hey, hold on, I'm not sure if that's serving you right, because that's not true. So how can you try to find truth within yourself? Like when you are in the midst of something and you're like, what is happening here? Okay, now the step happens where I put on my unbiased reality filter. So to make sure that you're not lying, how do you stop yourself when you are telling yourself a story?
I don't know if you can do that for yourself.
Okay. So you think you do need another person?
Well, and not only that, I do think that that's helpful, but I think that a person only arrives at that place where they want to be honest with themselves, and then will solicit the support of someone close to them to help them do that, only after they have suffered from their delusion enough.
Okay.
I think the Kabbalists are right about that. So in Kabbalism, they say, yeah, you have free will, but it's like this big. You're not very free. You're not nearly as free as you think you are. You're self-deluded. But you do have this little tiny speck of free will. So that when you finally get to the place where you've been subject to the suffering of your delusion long enough, and it's hurt enough, and it's produced so much fear and anxiety enough that you're ready. And you just want reality for what it is. And you'll start down that road.
And that can be a terrifying journey for sure, to say, I'm no longer going to tell myself the pretty little lies that make life more bearable. And I've struggled with that as well. I mean, especially discovering.
Everybody has.
Yeah. But discovering somebody like Jordan Peterson, who holds, which I would say he holds a little bit too much of the doom side of things, as far as like, you will suffer, you need to be strong enough to handle it, and these are some tools, this is how you can do that, and you need to, that's your responsibility as a human being, is to essentially take care of your own shit. Like, you have to be able to do that. You can't be somebody who blames other people, who suffers, and then you don't know why you're here. Like, that's, you need to be figuring that stuff out. He holds a little bit more of the, like, life is horrible. It can be horrible. There's these dark sides of it, and there is no way to avoid it. And if you think you can avoid it, that is also one of those lies.
Right.
So I struggled with taking what he had to say, because there was a part of me that was like, but life can't be that horrible. Like, maybe he's been through some bad stuff, but like, to tell everyone that everyone's going to suffer, like, come on. But it had to be something that was uncomfortable for me to think about for a moment, to say, okay, no, there is definitely truth there. And that is important for people to do. So, and I notice in myself when my brain starts to cut off my openness to something, which I'm not, 0% of me has worked through the, oh, I don't believe what you're saying, or I don't agree with you, so I'm going to shut that off. Like, no, I still do that. But I'm trying to be more aware of when I do that, and when my mind is like, nope, that goes against what you've told yourself and what you think is true, So within conversation, and really this podcast is more so about how to keep a conversation going without people just being like, la, 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 la. Yes. So when it comes to something like that, where it's completely a personal journey, me getting over my fear of death is that's not even getting over a fear of death. I don't even know what this is, what I want out of this, but I think we can find some parts of humanity in each person. I think we all have similar things, and I think getting down to the bottom of what it is that everyone can say, yeah, I've thought about that before, or yeah, I am struggling with that thing. And in this podcast, at least, we've realized that the unknown is something that humans are not wired to be okay with.
Right.
And so when it comes to new subjects, new information, new opinions, new whatever, have you discovered a trick or something within you to say, remain open to this because you are probably going to learn something? Have you discovered anything like that within you?
Well, I have a tool because I know that I do that. I have a tool that I use to help me to be aware of when I'm doing that, and that's just contemplative prayer, meditation.
Okay.
Mindfulness.
What does that
whatever
look
you want
like
to label
for you?
it.
Yeah.
It looks like focusing on whenever I feel angst, I'll begin to focus. I'm really anxious. I'm feeling very insecure. I wonder why. And then I'll just stop and I'll take at least 10 minutes and I'll just really focus on that. Sometimes I'll get an answer. Most of the time I would say I get an answer actually. Sometimes you don't.
Do you feel like the answer is something accurate that says, this is where it's coming from? Like, what would you say an answer looks like?
When the angst is genuinely gone, but see, this is the trick. This is the all I can say is that I have experienced a release of anxiety that feels as free as I've ever felt that. Maybe I still have some of that, but I just don't know yet. You see what I'm saying?
Yeah.
So I'm open to that. But
sorry, I just said right out loud.
I thought you were saying that's it.
I just heard my...
No.
That's enough time. I can't deal with this anymore.
No. I'm sorry. My mic was muted.
So anyway, the tool that I use is meditation. It's being mindful, being aware. Richard Rohr says, when you practice contemplation, it's not just a time sitting in a quiet room with a candle lit or something. Like he does that. He has a regular practice every morning. He'll wake up, make his coffee, sit and stare at a candle to keep what he says, his monkey brain busy so that he can engage at a higher state of consciousness. But it's not just that. It's that is important for establishing some foundational mindfulness. Then you'll find that when you're living your life, on the way over here, as an example, on the way over here, I was thinking about a particular thing that was bothering me, and all of a sudden I noticed these two beautiful little white butterflies literally flying around me, like encircling me. Mm-hmm. And so I just stopped. Yeah, that's awesome. That brings a joy to life. I'm sorry. Mm-hmm. It sounds really goofy to a lot of people, but
no, it's totally true.
But it is. And why are these things doing this? Like, where did they even come from? I don't know. And you know what? I have some joy in not knowing how this happened and why they're being so weird and why they're willing to fly around me. And I think the one landed right. I couldn't tell for sure. I was like, I don't want to scare you. But not knowing opens up all these possibilities. Like, man, what if maybe these are entities? Maybe these are, who knows? It sounds crazy, but you don't know.
Right.
It just be, God's way, whatever you want to call it, of letting me know that, look, it's going to work out. It's fine.
Right. Do you let your imagination kind of run wild when it comes to the question, why are we here? What is the point of this? Why do we have interactions like that
Yes.
Deja vu? There's so many things that people experience in life that really trigger either the imagination or the, I don't know, and I'll never know, or there's nothing special about those butterflies, like they just happen to be there. So do you let your imagination take it to where it is the most meaningful it could possibly be? Or do you try to stay as like practical about these mystical things that happen?
Both. Because, and what I mean by that is, I'll think about the possibilities, which are, endless. So I'll go wild with that, but try to remain open to just what would Sam Harris say that was about? An atheist, materialist, what would they say about that? So, because I think that they have something valuable to offer us. If you tend to kind of fly off into la la land too much, then you're not dealing with reality anyway. You're not a contemplative.
Right.
So I try to have those conversations with both polar sides, I guess you could say.
Yeah. And I think that's why hearing someone's opinion that differs from your own, that's why I think watching Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris have a civil debate when they did those ones with Weinstein, kind of, whatever the word is. What did he do?
The debate.
He
was the moderator. Yeah.
That's it. Watching them do that was so interesting because you see these two people coming from such wildly different backgrounds, essentially, and they are trying to find common ground to say, this is where I agree with you, and this is where I don't agree with you. Because when you can make those lines very clear, then Jordan learns from Sam and Sam learns from Jordan on those areas that they say, this is where I don't agree with you. And it's the most boring thing ever to talk to someone who's just like, yeah, I agree with everything that you're saying, because then you're bouncing basically your own brain off of something else that's saying, this is all true. And it's uncomfortable to talk to somebody who doesn't agree with everything that you're saying. So did you learn kind of how to have a civil disagreement / discussion with someone and the value of it? Is that what, because that's what Jordan Peterson and Sam Harris brought to the table for me, as far as this is important. We need to be doing more of this kind of stuff. Do you feel like you learned something from that?
I did, but I learned it the hard way. And I learned it the hard way because I went through a phase of kind of black and white. This is the truth, and it has to be, and that's why I'm going to do my best to argue that truth. So very fundamentalist in my views, and I remember one experience that was kind of pivotal for me. A seminary student came to the church where I was working, and he and I got into a discussion where universalism came up, and his arguments for his views of universalist views, I really struggled to debate with. And I thought, what's more important, Brett? I remember thinking this. What's more important? That you are able to persuade people to believe what you think should be true, or that you are a person of truth? And something clicked there when I said that to myself. To be truly free is to be actually true. So in other words, be a person that pursues the truth. Then, if you're wrong, that's okay. That's part of the process of being someone who pursues the truth.
Right.
That's inevitable. So you don't have to be this on the defense all the time, trying to defend what you think should be true. And then I was better able to look at some of the things I believe and said, look, in reality, I don't really know that that's true. So people freak out when you start talking like that. And I literally had someone sabotage my work there as a result when I started talking to him about that. Someone that was a licensed counselor. Wasn't supposed to divulge anything that I talked about, but did.
Oh boy.
Yeah. And even made up stuff.
Oh, so, yeah. No.
Yeah. So people get that just, I'm only bringing that up because it shows how afraid people are to have their pseudo certainty messed with. But man, that's where real freedom is. It's when you can admit when you don't know something. And you can dialogue with someone that you might learn from. And this is Jordan Peterson, who I admire so much. Okay, so I want to qualify this this is my disclaimer. I'm not saying this in a disparaging way whatsoever, but I feel what you feel. Like you're landing on negativity that is not realistic. I have no problem with landing where things are actually negative. Mm-hmm. And usually I can agree with him. But there are places I wish I could remember some quotes or something where I go, you don't know that. He's normally supremely rationalistic, so I really admire him. But there are times when...
Have you ever known anybody that you agree with all the time?
Of course not.
I mean,
right.
And that's where
Although... No, go ahead.
I was going to say, I think personal experience from his own life, I think that's where I would say the argument for where he lands, which, again, this is the thing that I had to think of, because I'm like, I want to believe every single word that he's saying. And there's a part of me that says, but what do you actually believe? Like, don't just be the person that absorbs everything and doesn't have any sort of way of filtering through to say, what do I actually take? Because, and I think that's actually an issue that a lot of people have, where they don't stand up on their own 2 feet and they don't say, I think this thing and this is why. Not just simply, well, I think that. Well, why? Well, because I just think it. Like, you have to have a good enough reason. And my reason would be, I haven't seen malevolence. And if I were to sit here and take what Jordan Peterson says, which is 100% you will experience that in your life. You will have that experience. And I'm like,
this is one of the things where I thought,
and I think
not everyone is going to experience malevolence.
Right.
I just don't believe that.
And I think it's because,
depending on what he means by that, but
he's also a counselor, so he has seen people who have been touched by malevolence, and
he's been baptized in it, immersed,
exactly.
fully immersed. Yeah.
And so that's where I'm like, I think his experience brings that to light to say there is way worse stuff in life than you've ever been exposed to. And I agree with that. I know that that's true. But when it comes to, I have to prepare because the storm is coming for me, I'm like, but what does that storm look like? Is it as bad as it was for you, Jordan? Because there are some people who live their lives and they don't really get touched by much craziness. And then there's some people who get, it's like just back to back to back. And you're just like, how do they stay alive? This is crazy. So I think life itself is on a scale. The experiences that you have are what dictate the reality that you see, essentially. Mm-hmm. And, we talked a little bit about dreams before and how, I mean, I don't think that dreams are just random filings because of the stuff that you've been through that day. I think there is something there that we just don't understand at all. And I think the reason we shove it aside is because how do you ever get to the point of understanding what dreams are? You can do studies all you want, but like the individual person and what their individual dream means to them is so like specific to that person that you would have to do dream studies on literally every single person to understand it. So I'm like, is that just a wash? Are we just like, let's not even focus on that because why does that matter? Or
I think it does, though.
Right.
I do. And Freud and Carl Jung and Winnicott and all these famous psychoanalysts would agree with that. So yes, you can learn a lot from your dreams, a lot. Mm-hmm. And yes, they are specific, but then there are these archetypal images that come through that really don't have much to do with you as an individual at all, and more to do with what Jung would call the collective unconscious of humanity that we've inherited. It's kind of like a higher form of instinct that we inherit as human beings. So
I really, really want to open up a dialogue with my viewers on the channel and to just build some sort of community around these kinds of topics. So yeah, thanks for listening. Thanks for watching. Thank you, Brett, for being here.
Thanks for having me.
And we'll see you next time.